Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm continuing with my exposition of my translation of Luke's Gospel. We've come to chapter 9 and verse 40. In the prior context, the Lord went across the lake and took care of the legion over yonder, got rid of 2,000 pigs. And so now he's coming back, and verse 40 tells us what happens when he gets back at his side of the lake. I will now read verses 40 through the first half of 42. Desperate father. Now it happened when Jesus returned that the crowd welcomed him because they were all waiting for him. And then there came a man named Jairus, and he was a ruler of the synagogue. He fell down at Jesus' feet and started begging him to come to his house because he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. Just to comment, if you go around doing what Jesus did, you're going to become public property as he became. They were waiting for him. He couldn't go anywhere without being followed and without being bothered, if I may use that expression. Now, we have an interruption. That is to say, in Luke's Gospel, all of a sudden Jesus starts out, but comes this woman and touches the back of the edge of his garment and so on. Now, I find this case to be very, very interesting. I've written a harmonization. There are three accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I'm going to read to you the harmonization that I have written. And the text of Luke will be the third text, so I won't read that because it's going to come in the article, all right? So now, if you have my New Testament, in the appendix is number 4 in that appendix. So now I'm not going to read about the desperate woman. The relevant texts are Matthew 9, verses 20 through 22, Mark chapter 5, verses 24 through 34, and Luke chapter 8, the second half of 42 through 48. I will read the text in that order. Matthew 9. And then a woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment, for she kept saying to herself, "If I only may touch his garment, I will be healed." But Jesus turned around and seeing her said, "Take courage, daughter, your faith has made you well." And the woman was healed from that very hour. That is Matthew's account. It's very short. Now let's go to Mark chapter 5. A large crowd was also following him, and they were pressing around him. Now a certain woman who had been bleeding for 12 years and had suffered many things under many doctors and had spent all that she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came from behind in the crowd and touched his garment. Parenthesis, she had kept saying, "If I can just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Close parenthesis. Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she knew in her body that she was healed from the affliction. And instantly Jesus perceived within himself that some power had gone out of him. And turning around in the crowd, he said, "Who touched my clothes?" So his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he kept looking around to see who had done it. So the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go into peace and be healed from your affliction." Now I will read Luke chapter 8, second half of verse 42. Now as he was going, the crowds were pressing against him, and a woman suffering with a flow of blood for 12 years, who had spent her whole livelihood on physicians, but could not be healed by any, approaching from behind, touched the border of his garment, and immediately the flow of her blood stopped. So Jesus said, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter and those with him said, Master, the people are pressing against you and crowding in, and you say, Who touched me? But Jesus said, Someone did touch me because I noticed power going out from me. Now, when the woman saw that she could not hide, she came trembling and falling down before him. She told him in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she was healed immediately. So he said, Courage, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go into peace. Okay, there we have the three inspired accounts. Now I'm going to try to explain what happened. Here we have a moving account of faith, determination, and perseverance. And perhaps it'll have some practical lessons for us. My discussion will attempt to follow the actual sequence of events. Matthew's account is abbreviated, so I will depend mainly on the other two. Number one, the street was presumably not very wide, and both Mark and Luke inform us that it was filled with a crowd that was pressing around and against Jesus. Indeed, Mark 5:31 and Luke 8:45 reinforce the observation. Obviously, this represented a problem for the woman. How could she get to Jesus through that crowd? The more, especially if it was made up mostly, if not entirely, of men. For any woman to push through a crowd of men would be unacceptable. But she had an added problem. From Matthew 9:1 and the context, we may conclude that this episode transpired in Capernaum, which really was not all that big a town. The point is, that woman would be a known person. The available space was packed with people. The crowd was on both sides of Jesus as well as behind, so she would have to force her way through. However, this represented a difficulty beyond just being rude. According to Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 through 27, any discharge of blood made a woman unclean. And verse 25 deals with prolonged hemorrhage. Anyone who touched her or even her clothes became unclean as well. So everyone she touched on her way through the crowd became unclean. Now, she and her problem were well known. So the people she touched were not happy. She no doubt got plenty of dirty looks and maybe a few elbows, as well as some choice expressions. It would have been easy to give up, but she kept repeating her expectation to herself, as in Matthew 9:21, to keep up her courage, and she was desperate. So why was she desperate? She, quote, had been bleeding for 12 years and had suffered many things under many doctors and had spent all that she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. That was in Mark 5. In other words, she was at the end of her financial resources and of any medical hope. Mark almost seems to be accusing the doctors of malpractice. Luke, himself a doctor, is more cautious. Quote, a woman suffering with a flow of blood for 12 years who had spent her whole livelihood in position, but could not be healed by any, end quote, Luke 8. No wonder the woman was desperate. But then she heard about Jesus, Mark 5:27, and all of a sudden she had hope. Well, number 4, she managed it. She wormed through the crowd and touched the hem of his garment. Mark 5 says, immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she knew in her body that she was healed from the affliction. Note that all she had to do was touch. Now, that sort of thing, people getting healed just by touching his clothes, happened repeatedly during the Lord's earthly ministry. Jesus could have let the incident pass, like all the other times. But he chose not to. He stopped and turned around. Number 5. Quote, instantly Jesus perceived within himself that some power had gone out of him, and turning around in the crowd, he said, "Who touched my clothes?" That's Mark 5. When Luke writes that all denied it, 8:45, we may understand that it was by their silence. No one spoke up. But Jesus insisted. He kept looking around to see who had done it. Mark 5. When the disciples protested he was being touched all the time by the jostling crowd, Jesus said, "Someone did touch me because I noticed power going out from me." He was referring to a purposeful touch. Now, the woman had evidently withdrawn into the crowd and may even have been hidden behind others, but Jesus did not let her get away with it. Number 6, when the woman saw that she could not hide, she came trembling and falling down before him. She told him in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she was healed immediately. Luke 8. That was not easy in front of the crowd, but Jesus gave her no choice. Was Jesus just being mean? Was he just being cruel? No, he was actually doing her a big favor. The people knew who she was and about her physical problem. So Jesus was declaring her healing and therefore her cleansing to the assembled multitude. And by implication, those who had been contaminated by the woman could relax on that score. He got rid of that as well. Verse 7, and this will end my little effort. Then Jesus said to her, quote, "Courage, daughter, your faith has saved you. Go into peace and be healed from your affliction." Mark 5 and Luke 8. That is what the text says. Into peace, not in peace. To go in peace is to leave on good terms, no hard feelings. But what might going into peace be? I would say that you take the peace with you. If you're inside of it. You live within an atmosphere of peace. Now that is a proper blessing. Sovereign Jesus never said go in peace. He always said go into peace. He was giving the person a new life. And that woman got a new life, okay? And that deserves a doxology. Okay, that is my little harmonization. So I've already read verses 42 and a half, 40 through 48 here in Luke. So now we will go directly to verse 49, where Jesus raises the dead girl. So I'll read now verses 49 through 56, and that'll finish chapter 8. While he was still speaking, here came someone from the synagogue ruler's house, saying to him, "Your daughter has died. Don't bother the teacher." But upon hearing it, Jesus reacted by saying to him, "Don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house, he allowed no one to go in except Peter, John, James, the father of the child, and her mother. Now all were weeping and mourning for her, but he said, "Do not weep. She is not dead, but sleeping." They started ridiculing him, knowing that she had died. Oh, he put them all outside, and grasping her hand, he called, saying, "Child, arise." Then her spirit returned, and she got right up, and he dictated that she be given something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. For the moment, the people knew the girl had died. So, of course, they say, "Who are you trying to kid? We know she's dead." So he just got rid of them, pushed them all out. That just left the 3 disciples plus the parents. He grasped the girl's hand and he called out, "Child, arise." And she got right up. Now he dictated that she be given something to eat. Does that strike you as being strange? Nothing like being practical. She'd probably been a while without eating. And then he tells her parents not to talk about it. Now, of course, that was going to be difficult. He couldn't keep that secret. Like the house was full of mourners. They all knew that she had died, and they would all now see her skipping around alive, playing outside. You can't keep that quiet. But anyway, that it was. We told them not to spread it around, but they didn't have to say anything. The people would. We'll come now to chapter 9, and Jesus sends out the 12 disciples. I will read now verses 1 through 6. Then he called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all the demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And he said to them, quote, "Take nothing for the journey, neither staffs, nor knapsack, nor bread, nor money, neither have 2 tunics apiece. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and depart from there. But as many as do not receive you when you depart from that town, shake off even the dust from your feet as a testimony against them." So they set out and went around, village by village, evangelizing and healing everywhere for the moment. Notice the text says that Jesus gave them power and authority over all the demons. I take it that during their tour, probably wasn't very long, a couple of weeks probably, no demon that they encountered was able to resist them. They had authority over all of them. But that is going to contrast with what we're going to find in this same chapter, Luke chapter 9, verse 40. There's going to be a demon that they can't cast out. But that, of course, was after they had gotten back. That was after their tour. But I take it that during the tour, that's how come they were so surprised later. How come we couldn't do it? During the tour, all the demons obeyed. Anyway, Jesus gave them that authority. Cure, heal, proclaim the kingdom. Now, in verse 3, we have a minor difficulty. The true text says, "Take nothing, neither staffs," plural. Perhaps 15% of the Greek manuscripts have staffs as singular. I'll take a staff, to be followed by most modern versions. But in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 10, the percentage is 5%. But to put the singular here and in Matthew contradicts Mark chapter 6 and verse 8, where all texts have only a staff. A staff. In Luke and Matthew, the vast majority of the Greek manuscripts read neither staffs, plural, which does not contradict Mark. The case of the staffs is analogous to that of the tunics. They're told to just take one, not several. What are you going to do with 2 tunics? You only need one. What are you going to do with 2 staves or staffs? All you need is one. They weren't going to be gone that long anyhow, a couple of weeks. So, the correct text here is staffs, so as not to set up a contradiction with Mark. Now, any place you enter, stay there. See about this. In other Gospels, it says not to move around. That's in other words, if you see another house who thinks going to treat you better, but don't do that. You stay where you are. Now we come to the problem of not being received. You aren't received. When you leave, shake off even the dust from your feet as a testimony against them. And in the parallel passages, it gets really heavy. We can do it too. I myself have done it. Yes, I have. You can see more about this in Matthew 10, verses 14 and 15, Mark 6, verse 11, and Acts 13:51, where Paul did it. And in Matthew 11, verses 23 and 24, Jesus himself gave the example. He didn't shake off the dust. He pronounced the curse on Horizon, Bethsaida, Capernaum. You can go back and check it, Matthew 11. It's a very serious matter, by the way. This works. You better be careful about doing this. It works. So they went around village by village. I take it that each pair was assigned a particular village to which Jesus was going to go. I get that from the parallel accounts. Now we come to Herod. Herod is father. Do we read now verses 7 through 9? Now Herod, the tetrarch, heard of all the things being done by him, that's Jesus, and he was perplexed, because it was said by some that John had risen from the dead, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the ancient prophets had arisen. But Herod said, John I beheaded. So who is this about whom I hear such things? And he started trying to see him. Just by the way, apparently he never succeeded until the very end, when you may remember that Pilate sent Jesus over to Herod. That's in Luke 23, verses 6 through 12. So Herod was frustrated. All that time he had tried, he wanted to see Jesus, but he never managed it, apparently. Now we come to verses 10 through, well, I'm going to read actually through 17. It's about feeding the 5,000 men. I'm going to read all the way from verse 10 through verse 17. When the apostles returned, that's the 12 he had sent out, they reported to him all that they had done. Then he took them and withdrew privately to a deserted place belonging to a town called Bethsaida. But the crowds, being aware, followed him. So he received them and started speaking to them about the kingdom of God, and he cured those who needed healing. Now when the day began to decline, the 12 approached and said to him, dismiss the crowd so that they may go to the surrounding villages and their farms, lodge and find food, because we are in a deserted place here. But he said to them, you feed them. So they said, we have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all this crowd. Parenthesis, there were about 5,000 men, without the women and children. But he said to his disciples, make them recline in groups of 50. And they did so, making them all recline. Then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the multitude. So they all ate and were filled, and 12 baskets of the pieces they left were taken up. For the moment. Let's go back here and see what we have. I take it that when the apostles came back, but also this was just right after Herod had, I believe he had killed John. Anyway, I think so. You have to check the parallel, but I take it that the Lord wanted just to get away and assimilate the news. So he took them and withdrew privately. Pay attention to what it says here, please. To a deserted place belonging to a town called Bethsaida. Now then, I have to stop here and talk about this a bit. I have a long footnote if you have my translation. Instead of a deserted place belonging to a town called Bethsaida, half of 1%, 0.5% of the Greek manuscripts of objectively inferior quality, demonstrably so, I can prove that, they have a town called Bethsaida, followed by the modern versions. The problem with that is that the eclectic text currently in vogue, along with the modern versions that follow it, following the 0.5%, have Jesus and company going into the town of Bethsaida. But in verse 12, right here in Luke, the disciples say they're in a deserted place. Thus, a contradiction is introduced. The eclectic text here is at variance with itself in the parallel passages. In Matthew 14:13, all texts have Jesus going to a deserted place. And in verse 15, that's still Matthew, the disciples say the place is deserted. In Matthew 6:31 and 32, all texts have him going to a deserted place. And verse 35, that's Mark, the disciples say it is a deserted place. So, the eclectic text not only makes Luke contradict himself, but sets Luke against Matthew and Mark. And this on basis of only 0.5% of bad manuscripts. Now that's perverse. That is dirty. That is wrong. You do not introduce contradictions to the text on that basis. However, there's more to the story. I want to carry on here just a little bit more. From the parallel accounts, it appears that Jesus embarked at Capernaum. And from John, chapter 6, verse 23, we learn that the destination was near Tiberias. Well, of course, Capernaum and Tiberias are both on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, but there's a large bay between them. So they went over several miles of water, probably at least 10 miles, I think. I forget. The crowd was not about to let Jesus get away. Mark makes clear that they ran along the shore. They could see the boat. They ran along the shore. The faster runners stayed even with the boat and were waiting on the shore when the boat put in. The others were spread out behind, like for several miles, like in a marathon. They kept coming, kept arriving. And any late starters could see the stragglers and could easily follow the action. Okay, apparently, Jesus immediately started to heal the sick and went on to teach, Matthew and Mark. But just where was it? That's what I'm coming to. Just where was it? John says it was near Tiberias. But as I've read in Luke chapter 9, verse 10, it said a deserted place belonging to a town called Bethsaida. And Bethsaida, as you know, is it's at the top of the lake, but on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Not that it's a long ways away, long distance. What I assume is that the place was indeed near Tiberias, but did indeed belong to Bethsaida. Either it had been deeded to the town somehow, or more likely, the family that owned it was based in Bethsaida. Any near neighbors could not use it. It belonged to someone else. So it was basically untouched. A great place for a picnic. After the feeding, Mark 6:45 says that Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida. So why did Jesus send the disciples to Bethsaida? My suggestion is that it was to give an accounting to the owner of the place where the multitude was fed. Just think about that. 5,000 men plus women and children, maybe 15,000 people. They were there for a good many hours. You know, they can make quite a mess. Just think about what happened. You know, you need a bunch of bushes around and all that. What I suspect is that Jesus had permission to use the place when he wanted to get away. Like on this side, he wanted to get away. But no one had foreseen such a crowd as that. So from Matthew and Mark, I gather that from Bethsaida, Jesus went directly to Gennesaret, spending the minimum time necessary in Bethsaida, because the next day he's already in Capernaum, as you can see in John. So just because we have this problem in the text that the so-called critical text really patchwork quilt and eclectic text. They've created a contradiction that is not in the true text. I just wanted to make that clear. Okay, now let's go back. Have you ever thought about this? The 5,000 men, let alone the women and children, there was a bunch of people. And Jesus says, hey, you guys feed them. Have you ever thought about that? With what? How are you going to feed at least 10,000, maybe 15,000 people? And they most of them didn't have lunch, but they've been there a long time. It's at least 5 o'clock in the afternoon, all right? Even if you go to nearby towns, how many bread stores, if there were any bread stores, would have any bread left at 5 o'clock in the evening? They would make their bread early in the morning and they would sell it early in the morning. So no one's going to have the kind of bread you would need to feed 10,000 or 15,000 people. So even this bit about, sending the people around to the neighboring town, that was a cop-out. They just wanted to get rid of the people. No way the people were going, no, come on, there's too many people. But the Lord commanded them to do it. What if you were there? What if I was there? What would we have done? Just like the disciples. You solve it. Oh dear. Well, I don't know if you ever thought about this very much, but let's think about it a little bit. Okay, so Jesus, make them sit down, groups of 50, 100, and so on. All right. And Jesus takes the bread and the fish, and he blesses it and breaks it, and he hands it to the disciples. Now you have to understand that when he did, each disciple just had a little bit of bread and fish in his hand. Jesus did not multiply all of that sufficiently, right? There would have been a mountain of bread and fish. It would have covered him and the disciples and the guys people that were closest. No. I want you to see the faith of the disciples. So here's a disciple. They have a little bit of fish, of bread and fish in the hand. And let's say there are 12 disciples, and if there are 12,000 people, each disciple has to take care of 1,000 people. And all he's got, like if you were one of those 12, and here you are, and you're facing 1,000 people, all you got is this little bit of bread and fish in your hand. What are you going to do? Wouldn't you feel a little bit ridiculous advancing, going on, and going to the first person? Here, help yourself, please. But they did. I take it that the disciples did not go meandering all around. I take it that the people then started passing around, and it never quit. They'd take a piece and it never quit. They took a piece and it never quit. They took a piece and it never quit. Because at the end, there were a whole lot of pieces left over. And God, to this day, he's saying to us, give them to eat. Only now we have people all over the world that have never heard. And Jesus is still saying to us, you give them to eat. It doesn't depend on our empty hands. It depends on his full hands. Well, they took up 12 baskets full of pieces. Of course, that collecting was done by others. And in any case, the leftover bread was used by other people. You remember that one day after they got in the boat, they didn't have any bread. Where did they get all these baskets? These were huge baskets. Where did they get all these baskets? Well, they were right near Tiberias. There would be fishing boats there. And everyone would be curious about this huge crowd. And probably the fishing boats lent them their baskets, which would smell like fish. Then again. So probably the owners of the baskets got the contents. That is, they got their baskets back, loaded with bread and fish. Thank you very much. Not a bad deal, actually. Now, just before I'm going to go on now to verse 19, but I want to say that between verse 17 here and verse 18, I take it that there was an interval of several months. And what happened during those several months, you can find in Matthew chapter 15, 1 through 16, 12, Mark chapter 7, verse 1 through chapter 8, verse 26, and in John chapter 6, verses 16 through 71. That's just if you're curious about that. Now, we come now to chapter 9 and verse 18, and from this moment on, Jesus is going to minister on the basis of his impending death. I'm going to read now verses 18 through 22. Now it happened, as he was alone praying, that the disciples joined him, and he questioned them, saying, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" In answer, they said, "John the Baptizer, but others say Elijah, while others that one of the ancient prophets has arisen." Then he said to them, "But you, who do you say that I am?" In answer, Peter said, "The Christ of God." But he, that's Jesus, strictly warned and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, "The Son of the Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and the third day be raised up." End quote. Now, actually, I just want to comment very briefly on what's in verse 20. Peter answered, "The Christ of God." Now, he was speaking Hebrew and probably said the Messiah. But of course, the Greek text has Christ instead of Messiah. In a parallel text, Jesus says to Peter, "You are blessed because that didn't come from you, but from the Father." Like Jesus said that Peter was inspired by God in that particular statement. But then in a few minutes later, he's inspired by Satan, and that's a different story. You'll find that in Matthew, as I recall. Not here. Now, notice that Jesus prohibits them to tell people that he is the Messiah. He says, "Don't you do that." Why not? Because he now knows that he's going, well, he always knew he was going to the cross, but when he goes up to the mountain of transfiguration in verse 28, he gets the plan, he gets the time schedule from Matthew and Elijah, as we'll see when we get there. But now he tells them very plainly. He tells this to them numerous times. He says, "I'm going to suffer and be rejected and be killed and rise the third day." Okay, now let's come to verse 23 through 27. Then he said to everyone, and he said something privately to the disciples. They found him alone praying, but now, apparently different, everyone's around. Then he said to everyone, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Because whoever desires to save his life will waste it. And whoever wastes his life," in quotes, "for my sake, he will save it. Further, what is a man profited if he gains the whole world, yet wastes or forfeits his very self? Yes, whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, the Son of the Man will be ashamed of him whenever he comes in the glory, his and the Father's and of the holy angels. However, I tell you truly, there are some standing here who will certainly not taste death until they see the kingdom of God." For the moment, notice what the Lord says here at the beginning, verse 23. If you want to follow him, you've got to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow him. Just by the way, about 13% of the Greek manuscripts add "take up your cross daily," add the daily, as in most versions. But of course, if you take it up, then you've got it, right? So you have it all the time, you have it every day. You don't have to take it up every day. You've got it. Sounds like being without a cross is not an option. That's for those who follow Jesus. If you want to follow Jesus, you get a cross. Each one, my cross will be different from your cross, but we each get a cross. At least that's what I get out of this. Then he goes on, he says something that looks at first glance to be a contradiction. He says, if you want to save your life, you're going to waste it. You're going to throw it away. But if you, quote, waste your life for my sake, then you will save it. Now, how does that work? I take it that the Lord is talking about the potential that my life represents, your life represents. The only way not to throw away that potential, not to waste your life, is to live your life for the kingdom. You can see more about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 11 through 15. Talking about what we do now down here being tried by fire. Remember that? Wood, hay, stubble, gold, silver, precious stone. I think I have a footnote there on that also. Okay. Whoever is ashamed of me. The Lord is very serious here, right? Yeah, you've really got to take up your cross. What good does it do you to gain the whole world? If you throw away your life, your very self, if you forfeit it, if you've lived your life in vain, if you threw away your potential, what good did it do you? Then he says, what does it matter? What does it if you gain the whole world and you throw away your soul? Come on. Now notice verse 26. Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, the Son of the Man will be ashamed of him whenever he comes in his glory. Notice, ashamed of me and of my words. If you are ashamed of Jesus' words, that means that you don't agree with what he said, what he taught. And there are a lot of people who claim to be Christians, but they do not believe what Jesus believed. They do not believe what Jesus taught. They are, in fact, ashamed of what Jesus said. They don't believe it. And that's not a good thing, because he says if you're ashamed of what Jesus said and taught, he's going to be ashamed of you. Goodbye. Comes in the glory. That's the final accounting. Just by the way, the reason why people may be ashamed could be different, but you do not want to be a coward. In Revelation chapter 21, verse 8, it says that a coward does not enter the kingdom. You don't get into the holy city. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 33, Jesus said that he will deny before the Father whoever denies him before men. In other words, to cave in under pressure is definitely not a good idea. Okay? It is not a good idea. You don't want to do that. As cowards do not get into the holy city. That's very clearly stated in Revelation 21, verse 8. Very plain. He's talking about here the Father and the holy angels. It's the glory. Now, verse 27, he's talking about what's going to happen immediately thereafter at the Mountain of Transfiguration. He says some of the guys who are standing here are not going to taste death until they see the kingdom of God. And I will now read verses 28 through 36. It talks about that. Verse 28, now about 8 days after these words, it happened that he took along Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he prayed, the appearance of his face became different and his clothing dazzling white. And then two men started talking with him, who were Moses and Elijah. They appeared in glory and were explaining his departure that he was about to bring to fruition in Jerusalem. Now Peter and those with him were heavy with sleep, but becoming fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Then it happened, as they were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. And should we make three shelters, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah? Not knowing what he was saying. But as he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they became afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, listen to him. When the voice had ceased, Jesus was found alone. Parenthesis, they kept quiet and told no one in those days any of the things they had seen. Now then, we can gather from the account that they spent the whole night up there, which is how come the three disciples were heavy with sleep. They had probably been sleeping. And they wake up just as Elijah and Moses and Elijah are about to take off. But everyone, Jesus and they are transformed. They're bright, they're brilliant clothes and stuff. And what did Moses and Elijah come to do? Well, they came to clue Jesus in on the game plan, the final time frame. What's going to happen? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Talking about his exit or his departure, that's the way it is in the text, that he was about to bring to fruition in Jerusalem. They came to give him the details. And you'll see that from this moment on, Jesus is very clear about what's going to happen. He now sets his face to Jerusalem and so on. Okay. Now, good old Peter. Peter just can't keep his poor mouth closed. He apparently wanted to, people want to stay up on the mountain, but down in the valley, there are demons. We like to be on the mountain, but we don't want to go down to the valley. But that's where the work is down in the valley. And Peter wanted to stay up on the mountain. He says, "Hey, Master, hey, let's build us some tents, 3, one for you and one for Moses." He wanted to hang on to me. Because it says here, as they were parting, verse 33, as Moses and Elijah were taking off, Peter wanted to, hey, wait, don't. Poor Peter. I wonder, how did Peter know who they were? How did Peter know who Moses and Elijah were? As he says, Moses and Elijah. How did he know that? I don't know, but he knew it. He didn't know what he was doing. It says here, he just couldn't keep his mouth shut. But the Father did not like it. There comes a voice, and Peter never forgot that voice. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, you see, Peter never forgot that voice. In fact, the Father was just rebuking Peter, telling him to shut up. He was speaking out of turn. The voice was not happy. The voice was not happy. And Peter never forgot that voice. This is my beloved Son. Well, about half of 1% of bad manuscripts have chosen instead of beloved. And guess what the modern versions do? They follow the 0.5% of bad manuscripts. I guess 99.5% of better manuscripts. Oh dear. Of course, they fell to the ground. They were face down. You don't get much. So then, of course, everything. Moses take off. Jesus is back to his normal appearance. So he touches him and says, "Get up." He was all by himself then. And he told them that they could not talk about it. That's why it says here they didn't tell anyone, but Jesus told them not to tell anyone. We can get that in parallel passages. Now, I told you they were there all night, verse 37. I'm not going to go on now. We'll save that for the next video. But verse 37 starts, it happened on the next day. So that's how come I knew that they spent the night up there. All right. Okay. By the way, it's in Mark chapter 9, verse 9, that the Lord commanded them not to mention anything until after his resurrection. It's very interesting. Until after the resurrection. Then you can talk about it. So they obeyed, evidently. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Because down in the valley there was a nasty, violent demon. And we'll get to that next time, God willing, in maybe 15 minutes or so. Thanks for watching, and God bless.